Hello and welcome to today's webinar featuring Geoff Bird. I'm Claire Cameron, Engagement Editor at Spectrum, the home for autism research, news and analysis. We'll begin the presentation in a moment, but first, know that we'll be fielding questions at the end of today's presentation, but you can ask them at any point during the session. To ask a question, submit them via the chat window to the left of your screen. And as always, I'll note that if there are any members of the press tuning in, you can only report information presented during this webinar if that material has already been published elsewhere, or if you have first obtained express written permission from the presenter. Geoff Bird joins us today from the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom. Professor Bird completed his BSc and PhD in psychology at the University College London. His postdoctoral work at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience, also at UCL, was supervised by Professors Uta and Chris Bird and focused on using fMRI to investigate the neural underpinnings of various behavioral traits common to autism. In January 2013, Bird joined the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London as a senior lecturer. He joined the University of Oxford's Experimental Psychology Department in January of this year as an associate professor. Professor Bird's work examines individuals' ability to perceive the internal state of one's body, known as interoception, and alexithymia, which is a subclinical condition characterized by the inability to identify and describe one's own emotions. Alongside his lab, he investigates the similarities and differences between people with alexithymia and people with autism in order to better understand emotion processing and empathy in each condition. Welcome, Professor Bird.
Thanks very much, Claire. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you for tuning in, for want of a better word. It's quite strange, to be honest, to be talking to my computer screen, but hopefully I'll get used to that soon. Just to give you a bit of a background, the approach I'm going to take, obviously I know that there's quite a mixed audience. Some of you may be scientists, others part of the autistic community, and obviously some both. So what I think I'm going to do is to give a lot of details of the experiment, but I just want to point out that a lot of the published work is available on our lab website for free. So if anybody is interested in more details, please feel free to look at the website. In terms of content, as we heard, I'm going to be speaking about autism and alexithymia. Alexithymia is a difficult word to pronounce. I say alexithymia. Some people say alexithymia. I'm not sure it really matters. It's as we heard, a subclinical condition where people high on this trait find it hard to identify and describe their emotions. Now, I'm interested in alexithymia because of something that happened a fair few years ago now. So I did my postdoctoral work with Professor Uta at University College London, who really is one of the pioneers of autism research. And so I've known a lot of the volunteers who help us in our research with autism for probably 15 years now. And actually, one incident really sparked my interest in alexithymia. So I was chatting to one of our volunteers, who I consider one of the kindest people I know, and he told me that he had applied for a position in a care home, and he was told that because he has autism, he lacks empathy, and therefore they wouldn't take him on as a carer. And to me, this just seemed really ridiculous, to be honest. One, because I knew that he was perfectly empathic, but also the assumption that everybody with autism lacked empathy just seemed slightly ridiculous. And when I spoke to my colleagues, I learned that a lot of people had this idea that autism was defined by a lack of empathy. And when I pointed out that some individuals with autism were perfectly empathic, in my view, I was just told, well, autism is very heterogeneous. If you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. And this was a bit unsatisfactory to me. I want to explain the heterogeneity in autism rather than just shrug my shoulders and say everyone with autism is different. So that's what I'm going to be trying to do today, to explain some of the heterogeneity in autism. Now, I'm guessing fact that you're listening to this presentation means that you know what autism is. But I think it's worth just reflecting on the role of emotion in autism and how autism is defined. So traditionally, we've had this idea that there's a triad of impairments in autism. Problems with behavioural flexibility and difficulties with social interaction and language. And until recently, in the kind of clinical criteria, a lack of empathy wasn't something that you had to have autism. But it's always really been the case that our diagnostic tools, so whether that's for a clinical diagnosis or a research diagnosis of autism, these tools identify emotional problems as part of the cluster of symptoms that defines autism. So it's not just a lack of empathy, poor eye contact. I'll explain why that's to do with emotions later, but also poor expression of emotion and difficulties understanding emotions and being reciprocal with emotions. And really the idea that people with autism lack empathy is really quite entrenched, I think, in the research community and even in institutions which advocate for autistic individuals. So the UK's National Autistic Society describe people with autism as having problems recognising and understanding other people's emotions and feelings and expressing their own. And perhaps the most obvious kind of example of this view is Simon Baron-Cohen's book, 0 Degrees of Empathy. I think the title there is probably not great. It probably doesn't actually represent what Simon believes about people with autism, and also gives the wrong impression. I guess to somebody that doesn't read the whole book, they may have the conclusion that if you're autistic, so this essentially is the standard view of autism. So if you're autistic, you have problems with empathy, problems with emotions. But obviously, like I said, I think many people with autism, and many people that know autistic individuals, know that this is not universally true. So there are many forums on the internet, YouTube channels, where people with autism and their families are really fighting against the stereotype. They're saying, just not true that everybody with autism lacks empathy. It's just not true that everybody with autism has problems understanding emotion. And actually, if you start to look at the research in this area, the scientific research, you realise that the picture is not so clear. So one of the problems, already hinted at this, is that we use the term empathy in a very loose way. So some people speak about imitating actions, part of empathy. Some people refer to theory of mind, so the ability to determine someone's mental state is empathy, whereas for other people, empathy is the sharing of emotion. So for me, empathy is the sharing of emotion. And I think we need to split out empathy from theory of mind. And people like Isabel Zierbeck have been doing this for a long time. When it comes to understanding emotions, certainly in emotional recognition, although, again, that individuals with autism can't recognise emotions, if you look at this, so here I've referenced a review paper, the conclusion is that behavioural studies are only slightly more likely to find facial emotional recognition deficits in autism than not. So we have this strange paradox. We have the generally accepted view that autism is associated with a lack of empathy, with problems recognising emotions, expressing emotions. Yet many people with autism, and those that know them, say this is not universally true. But like I said, the thing that we've been trying to do for a long time is to explain this difference. Try and say why it is that some people with autism will happily say they find it difficult to recognise emotions, whereas it's not true for everybody. So a while ago now, we wondered whether a subclinical condition called Alexithymia might explain some of these difficulties. So as I've briefly alluded to, Alexithymia has really two main characteristics. problems identifying which emotion you're feeling and describing the feelings. So having an emotion, you're just not sure whether you're sad, angry, or afraid, for instance. And sometimes difficulty distinguishing those emotions from hunger or from being too hot. So this is a relatively new idea, or new construct for alexithymia. It's only been around for 30, 35 years. And it's traditionally measured using self-report questionnaires. So people read a number of statements and rate the extent to which they agree with them. Statements such as, I feel confused about my feelings, I don't know whether I'm tired or angry. So we wondered whether alexithymia could be responsible for some of these so-called emotional symptoms of autism. The reason why we think this is that there's a much higher autistic population than in the typical population. So from our work, it seems about 50% of individuals with autism would score above a cutoff on these alexithymia measures, whereas only kind of 8 to 10% of the general population might score above cutoff. So our main question was, is it actually the case that alexithymia is responsible for these so-called emotional symptoms of autism? Is it the case that if by chance we happen to test people with autism and alexithymia, then they may show these emotional difficulties, whereas if we test people with autism without alexithymia, we don't. So maybe that explains why we have this big individual differences in the difficulties people report in their emotions and the conflicting findings in the scientific literature. So we'd be suggesting then that alexithymia explains the heterogeneity within the autistic population. But of course, all of this is to our most obvious question, which is why is there increased prevalence of alexithymia in autism? And I think something I should point out now is that there is nothing unique to autism in this regard. There is very high rates of alexithymia in substance abuse, schizophrenia, depression, eating disorders. So it's not that we think autism causes an increased risk of alexithymia. We think they're completely separate. But there is an obvious answer to this question. So why is there increased prevalence of alexithymia in autism? And the obvious answer might be that the theory of mind problems that we're pretty sure exist in autism explain why there's higher rates of alexithymia. But like I said, theory of mind refers to the ability to represent the mental states of other people. And we know that people with autism tend to have problems inferring the mental states of typical individuals. And actually some work that we've done in collaboration with people like Jennifer Cook showed the reverse is also true. So people without autism have problems inferring and understanding the mental states of people with autism. So what we were wondering, first of all, was, is it the case that theory of mind in autism leads to alexithymia? And if this is the case, you might imagine that it would be the theory of mind brain which are associated with levels of alexithymia in autism, and potentially the neural correlates, the parts of the brain underlying alexithymia, might be different in people with autism versus without autism. So if it's the theory of mind problems which underlie alexithymia in autism, potentially it's those networks that cause alexithymia in autism, and potentially different networks in those without autism. So together with people like Georgia Solani and Tanya Singer, a while ago now, we decided to look at this question by asking people to reflect on their emotions in an fMRI scanner. So this is the thing that defines autism. So we try and induce an emotion and then ask people to reflect on the emotion. So think about how the snake makes them feel, or to do a very low-level task to judge whether there's more black or white in the picture, for instance. So what we're able to show is that when you're thinking about your feelings, you activate a part of the brain called the anterior insula, and the degree of activity in the anterior insula is correlated with alexithymia. So this was interesting. It suggested that this part of the brain underlies alexithymia. And what was interesting was that people with autism without alexithymia showed perfectly normal activity in this part of the brain. So already it seemed to be the case that autism and alexithymia were different things on a level of brain. And crucially, the anterior insula is not part of the theory of mind-brain network. So already we start to think that it's not theory of mind. It's problems that are causing alexithymia in autism. To follow this up, this was led by Boris Bernhardt and again with Tanya Singer. We looked at structural brain scans from people with autism and without autism. So this is a technique where we measure how thick certain parts of the brain are, and we do this in 3 different brain areas. So the medial prefrontal cortex, MPFC, the temporoparietal junction, TPJ, and this dorsal anterior insular region. Now the MPFC and TPJ are theory of mind areas, whereas the anterior insular brain that we found in our functional imaging results seems to be associated with working out how you feel. So we can measure the thickness of these 3 different brain areas, and we can look to see if there are other parts of the brain where we can predict the thickness of those areas based on the thickness of these 3 areas. So this technique is designed to identify functional networks in the brain from structural data. The idea is that if you've got different parts of the brain working together, then they're going to be of similar thicknesses. So we use this technique to identify functional networks, so 2 theory of mind networks, 1 network associated with the anterior insula, and we can see whether the coherence, so how well the thickness is correlated, is predicted by autistic traits and by alexithymic traits. So what we're able to show, and it's quite confusing on this graph, but the 2 theory of mind networks were very much impacted by autism traits, as we'd expect, whereas the anterior insular region network wasn't really impacted by autism to much less extent. Whereas when we looked at alexithymia, we could see that actually the theory of mind networks were not affected by autism, by alexithymia, whereas the anterior insular network was. So that's quite a complicated study, to be honest. It's hard to explain, probably hard for you to understand unless you're an expert in the area. But the message is quite simple. And the message is that the parts of the brain that seem to be associated with levels of alexithymia, with working out how you're feeling and whether you have difficulties, are not the same parts of the brain that are associated with theory of mind. So we don't think that, from our brain data, that alexithymia is a product of theory of mind difficulties in people with autism. So this is kind of a view that if you have autism, then you're not very good at reflecting on your emotions. And so actually, by giving people these questionnaire measures, those with autism won't be able to fill in the measures as well. I think this is kind of crazy, to be honest. And the data backs up that position. So one study which was conducted by Sylvia Berthoz and Elizabeth Hill, they asked people with and without autism to assess the level of alexithymia, and they did this over an extended time period. And they were able to show that those with autism were just as reliable across time in their alexithymia scores. And some work we did tried to assess whether these self-reported levels of alexithymia were actually valid. So we gave people with and without autism horrible pictures that were designed to evoke emotion in them. And they were pretty horrible pictures, open wounds, pretty awful images. And we measured objectively how much emotional arousal these pictures induced. So we measured this using changes in heart rate and changes in the sweatiness of the skin, galvanic skin response. And then we asked people just to report, tell us how affected they were by these pictures. And so we could calculate the degree to which their subjective reports of emotional arousal were consistent with our objective data of emotional arousal. And what we were able to show was that self-reported alexithymia, whether you have autism or not, predicts the degree to which these two measures are giving us the same story. So this seems to suggest that we can measure alexithymia using these self-report instruments just as well in those with autism as without autism. So I'm convinced that we can measure alexithymia in those with autism and that alexithymia is not a product of theory of mind difficulties. But then we get to our main question. So is it really the case that the fact that there's high levels of emotional symptoms of autism, so-called emotional symptoms? And to answer this question, we wanted a kind of a roadmap. If we're trying to assess this claim here at the bottom, that people with autism, a kind of a cognitive model of how empathy happens. And our idea is that in order to have an empathic response, you need to be paying attention to the right parts of the world. First of all, it's very hard to feel empathy for somebody if you're not looking at them. If you don't even realise that they're having an emotion, for instance. And that realising they're having an emotion is the second part of this model. So you need to be part of the world, you need to be looking at people, and then you need to be able to work out what state they're in. Are they in pain? Are they upset? Or are they happy? And the idea for empathy to take place is that by representing the person's emotion, this causes you to feel the same emotion. So if somebody's in pain, you feel their pain. If somebody's upset, you feel upset as well. And under some models, you need to be able to represent your own emotion. You need to realise that my pain is caused by the other person being in pain, that I'm upset because the other person is upset. This is kind of controversial. Whether you need that for empathy or not doesn't really matter. The crucial point is that once you've worked out somebody else is having a negative emotion or they're in pain, it causes that same state in yourself. So we already know that alexithymia is defined as a problem representing your own emotion. We know it's related to anterior insula activity. So if it's really the case that you need to be able to represent your own emotion, it's called empathic, to realise that your emotion is caused by somebody else, then we already know that alexithymia is going to cause problems with being empathic. But it's perfectly possible that we can ignore the representing our own emotion and just say that we need, for empathy to occur, we need someone else's condition to affect your own condition. So, given that we're reasonably confident that these high levels might be affected by alexithymia, we first wondered whether the first steps, this kind of mock model of empathy, would be affected by alexithymia. So, when I talk about experiments from now on, they have a general design, which is worth spending a little bit of time speaking about. So we call it the four-group design, in inverted commas. So we have a group of autistic individuals, a group of non-autistic individuals, and half of each group have high levels of alexithymia, and the other half have low levels of alexithymia. And this is really important, because this means isolate the impact of autism by comparing this group to this group, and alexithymia is this group. So we can separate out the effects of alexithymia and autism. But actually, this interaction is interesting. If we see an interaction with alexithymia, it means that the impact of alexithymia is different depending on whether you have autism or not. But for the moment, we can ignore that. We can just take on board the fact that these designs enable us to separate out the impact of autism from the impact of alexithymia. So let's look at this first part of the step. It's paying attention to the right part of the world. Now, there's been many studies, some published in very high-impact journals, that have claimed that by monitoring where autistic individuals look, so whether that's in real-world viewing paradigms or when they're watching films or movies, we can diagnose whether someone has autism with a high degree of reliability. So in these situations, what normally happens is we use eye tracking, people watch a movie, and we look to see whether, first of all, people look at the faces of the people in the movie or the background, and whether people look at the eye region or the mouth region. So there's been quite a few studies in this area, and what we find is we tend to generally look at faces less. So this is a measure of social. However, if we look at the ratio of eye versus mouth attentions, so the degree to which you look at the eye versus the mouth, this is very variable in experiments with individuals with autism. So sometimes you find that people with autism tend to look more at the mouth than typical individuals. Sometimes we don't. Now, this is important when it comes to recognizing people's emotions, because we know that this degree, this ratio of times you look at the eye versus the mouth is really predictive of your ability to recognize emotions. So we think it's the case that whether you look at the face or not is a measure of social attention. The degree to which versus the mouth is, in essence, a measure of emotional attention. It predicts how well you're going to do at recognizing people's emotions. Now, the fact that the eye versus mouth results are very mixed led us to think, well, maybe this is to do with alexithymia, and maybe this in part might the heterogeneity when it comes to things like emotion recognition in literature. So the first thing we did is analyze our results ignoring alexithymia, as has typically been done in the literature. So what you see here is a graph, and this dotted line here suggests people have no preference for the stimuli. So here we're looking at the amount of time people look at the face versus things in the background, so the face versus everything else. And we can see that our non-autistic group, so our control group, look at the face more than things in the background, things that aren't faces. Whereas our autistic group tend not to look at faces. So this is good. This replicates what's been found before. And if we look at our eye versus mouth ratios, we can see that the non-autistic group tend to pay more attention to eyes than mouths, whereas our show no preference or maybe they slightly favour mouth. So again, this is good. Our results support what's been found before. But crucially, we then analysed them separately as a function of autism and of alexithymia. And we found this double dissociation. So we found that ADOS scores, so this is a measure of autism symptom severity, but not alexithymia, predicted this social attention score, whether you pay attention to the face or the background. Whereas alexithymia predicted the opposite. So alexithymia, not autism symptom severity, predicted this emotional attention, this eye versus mouth ratio. So when I come back to our little model here, it seems that this first step, the crucial attention pattern, if I work out how someone's feeling, is affected by alexithymia, not by autism. So autism predicts whether you're going to look at people, and obviously that's important, but when you are looking at a face, the thing that helps you fixation ratio is driven by alexithymia, not by autism. So this is interesting. Right at the very first part of our model, it seems that alexithymia is important, maybe more important than autism, at least when it comes to these emotional factors of attention. What about our analysis of behaviour? So when we are paying attention to somebody's face, for instance, how well can we recognise their emotions? Now, as I said at the start, the literature, the scientific literature, on whether people with autism can recognise emotional facial expressions is incredibly mixed. Some people find problems recognising typical emotions, some people don't. So again, this is our indicator that maybe alexithymia is playing a role here. So we need to be careful though, because we already know that this eye versus mouth fixation pattern is important to when it comes to recognising emotional expressions. So we want to demonstrate that any impairment associated is not due to atypical attention to faces or to eyes versus mouth, and specific to emotion. We want to make sure that people with alexithymia just don't have problem processing faces full stop. So the way we did this was with a fairly complicated experiment. I'll just walk you through it. So we had stimuli that look like this. These are morph stimuli. So at one end, one identity, Harold. At the other end, we have a different identity called Felix. It was named by Rebecca Brewer, my student at the time. And Harold displays one emotional expression, in this case anger, and Felix displays another emotional expression, disgust. So from this end to this end, we are morphing across identity and across emotion from anger to disgust. So this is a conceptual representation of our stimuli. Now, these stimuli are important for a number of reasons, a number of experimental reasons, but they enable us to ask 4 questions, really. So first, we can ask whether individuals can recognize the identities. Do they know whether a particular face is Harold or Felix, for example? We can ask whether people can recognize the emotion. So do they know that this is anger versus disgust? And we can also present 2 stimuli at once and ask, is this the same identity? So is it the same person? And is it the same emotion? So are they both anger, for instance? And this enables us to do something, I think, quite nice. So one, we can see people's ability to recognize people, so recognize emotions. So if we're right about alexithymia, we would say, okay, alexithymia should predict problems with emotions, not with names, not with working out identity. And also, we can see whether people with alexithymia are building kind of a visual representation of the face. So we will predict that alexithymia is associated with problems recognizing emotions. But if we presented 2 angry expressions, we'd expect that they can see, an angry expression and disgust expression, we'd expect that they can see the difference. So we can make a really specific prediction. We can say that people with alexithymia should have problems recognizing emotions, be absolutely fine on recognizing identities, Harold or Felix, and be absolutely okay at recognizing low-level visual differences between the stimuli for the perceptual task. They had a really specific prediction. And when we analysed our results, that's what we found. So we looked to see whether people were able to recognise the identity and the expressions, and we found that actually your level of autism symptoms, so measured using the AQ, Time Baron-Cohen's AQ, or the ADOS, didn't predict performance on either your ability to recognise emotions or identity, whereas alexithymia was associated with this particular selective impairment in recognising emotions. So people like Pam Heaton, Elizabeth Hill, and Rory Allen have replicated these results in the vocal and the music domain. So I think this is quite interesting. And again, if we come back to our little model here, it seems that when it comes to recognising the state that people are in, actually autism is not associated with the problems in that. It's alexithymia that determines whether you're good or bad at that. Okay, now let's look at empathy. Like I said, if you complicated empathy task where people have to represent their own emotion, work out how they feel, and work out that their emotional state was prompted by somebody else's emotional state, then we already know that alexithymia is going to impact on that. So what we need is a kind of a low-level task to measure empathy, and we don't want people to rely on recognising emotional facial expressions, for instance, because we already know that's problematic in alexithymia. So we use this, was developed by Tanya Singer. This is her empathy for pain task, and this is doing the brain scanner. So what we do here, and this sounds kind of horrible, but we take great care that this is actually kind of ethical. So what happens is that we have our participants lying in the scanner. So their feet are here, pointer, and their heads deep in the MRI scanner, and a loved one sits next to them. And both our participant and the loved one have small electrodes on the back of their hand that can give them electrodes that they have judged to be painful, but they can cope with it. And again, we check that these shocks are they can cope with them, but they're still painful. So the person in the scanner, they don't need to look at the face of their loved one. What they see is just 4 coloured arrows, 1 of 4 arrows. So they know that if they see this light blue arrow here, they get a tiny shock, doesn't hurt at all, they can barely feel it. Whereas if they see this dark blue shock, they're going to get the shock that they've rated as painful, but not too bad. Then, if they see this light pink arrow, they know that their loved one is going to get a tiny shock, doesn't really hurt at all. Whereas if they see this dark pink arrow, they know their loved one is going to get, again, a shock that they've rated as painful, but they can cope with it. Now, this is a really nice paradigm that Khan has invented here, because what we can do is we can look at brain activity when you're receiving a nasty shock and compare it to brain activity when you receive a shock that doesn't hurt at all. And this comparison will identify those parts of the brain that are active when you yourself receive pain, when you're in pain. So we know the parts of your brain that are active when you're in pain. Then we can look in those parts of the brain and compare this condition, when your loved one receives pain, with this condition, when your loved one gets a shock that doesn't hurt at all really. Because then we can say, the parts of your brain that are active when you receive a shock, when you're in pain, are they active when your loved one does? So, do the parts of your brain which code for you being in pain, are they active when your loved one does? And we're able to show, we replicated Tani's results, that the anterior insula is active both when you receive pain and when your loved one does. But crucially, these are results from the group of autistic volunteers that took part, and we were able to show that those autistic individuals without alexithymia showed perfectly typical levels of empathic, whereas those with alexithymia didn't. And actually, this had nothing to do with the combination of autism and alexithymia, because what we found was that if you had alexithymia, you showed very low levels of this empathic brain activity, regardless of whether you had autism as well. And actually, there was no autism on this brain measure of empathy at all. So hopefully, this showed there is no empathy deficit in autism. I think it's worth me saying now, though, that I don't think people with alexithymia are in any way psychopathic, or in any way, I actually don't think they lack empathy. What I think is happening here is that, in fact, some of our later research has shown this, is that they get a very horrible negative state when they know that someone else is in pain, but they just can't interpret that as pain. So they know that they're not feeling good, but they're not sure if they're in pain or if they're stressed or anxious, and so they don't get this particular activity related to pain. But I think the crucial thing here is that there is no empathy deficit in autism. In fact, it's driven by alexithymia. And if we look at this attention to the eye versus mouth region, as I said before, related to emotional recognition, this is driven by alexithymia, not by autism symptom severity. We look at the ability to recognize emotions with faces and voices. This is driven by alexithymia, not by autism. And this measure of empathy, again, is driven by alexithymia, not by autism. Some of our recent stuff actually suggests that, in fact, this was replicated by a group recently, that actually we've known for quite some time that people with autism express emotions differently. And actually, typical individuals find it hard to read the emotional expressions of autistic individuals. And actually, we've shown that the atypical, the unusual expressions in autism is actually a result of alexithymia as well. So I think this is pretty interesting. I'm biased. But remember I said that levels of alexithymia And so we wanted to see whether we can replicate these results in another condition, which is associated with high levels of alexithymia. So this is a study that we've published recently in eating disorders. So we asked exactly the same question. We had a bunch of faces, which varied in identity, whose face it is, they varied in emotion, what emotion they were expressing. We used a different experimental paradigm, but in essence we're trying to assess how well people can recognize identities, who are faces, and emotions, how they're feeling. And again, we were able to show that it's alexithymia in the group of people with eating disorders that predicts your ability to recognize emotional facial expressions. It doesn't impact your ability to recognize identities, work out whose face it is, and there was no effect of eating disorder. So it seems like alexithymia is working in the same way, as it were, in autism and eating disorders. I mentioned before about the possibility of these interactions, so where we find that the impact of alexithymia differs according to whether you're autistic or not autistic. And actually we've seen that in a couple of decision-making paradigms that we've conducted recently. So one of the things we're interested in is the ability to make moral judgments, decide whether certain actions are morally acceptable or not acceptable. And so we did a study a couple of years ago where we asked people just to rate how morally acceptable certain statements were. And these statements were often designed to induce negative affect. So if you say to somebody, you better watch your back, at least in the UK, there's an implied threat there. You want someone to feel afraid. And we wanted to work out whether those with autism made to those without autism, and whether those with alexithymia made different moral judgments as to those without alexithymia. We found something quite interesting. We found that the ratings of how acceptable these statements were, how morally acceptable they were very well predicted by levels of alexithymia, but only in the non-autistic group. And we also recognize the emotion evoked by these statements. And again, alexithymia predicted your emotion judgments, but again, only in the group without autism. And what we think is happening here is that people with autism use much more sensible, rational, logical strategies to work out whether an action is morally acceptable. People without autism use all kinds of emotion rules. And therefore, if you're alexithymic and you're trying to use these emotion rules, you end up making different moral judgments. Whereas the autistic group were completely unaffected by levels of alexithymia. We found a similar pattern when we looked at something called the framing effect, which is a measure of how logical your decision making is. So most people, certainly most people without autism, show this framing effect where the choices here they have to choose between keeping £20 of initial £50 or taking this gamble where they can keep all the money or lose all the money. They have to choose between these two options. And they do so either in a gain frame where you're told that you initially have £50 and you can keep £20, or a loss frame. So you initially have £50 and you can lose £30 of it. So this choice here is mathematically the same choice here. It's just in this option, in the gain frame, the choice is presented as keeping £20 out of 50, where here in the loss frame, the choice is presented as losing £30 of initial 50. So what we showed before, and we showed it again, was that actually people with autism are much more rational. So here we see how much your choice is affected by this manipulation, this framing, presenting the choice as in the gain frame or the loss frame. And so people without autism are much more affected by this completely logical thing, whereas those with autism are much less affected. Now, again, what's interesting is that when we looked at how alexithymia impacts on the size of the framing effect, we found that if you didn't have autism, then alexithymia had a huge impact on this. Because this is an emotional bias. This is an emotional thing that affects your decision making, and therefore alexithymia, which lead to problems representing emotions, affects the results. Whereas if you're autistic, then actually you weren't affected by alexithymia at all. And again, we think that's because people with autism use much more rational, logical strategies to make a decision. So I've whizzed through that body of work, but what I think it shows, I think it provides us initial evidence that actually alexithymia is responsible for some of the so-called emotional symptoms of autism, and maybe explains the heterogeneity within the population of autistic individuals. We also think that it also might explain some of the emotional recognition deficits and eating disorders, and some of our most recent work suggests also in depression and schizophrenia. So this is all very interesting. I think this is potentially very useful for thinking about how we conceive of autism and how we diagnose autism, potentially how we treat autism and alexithymia. But we then ask the question, what is alexithymia? How should we characterize it? And one thing we thought might be going on is that if alexithymia is associated with problems working out which emotion you're feeling and deciding whether you're feeling an emotion or whether you're hot or hungry, for instance, then alexithymia might be a general failure of something we call interoception. So interoception is your ability to perceive the state of your body, work out how fast your heart is beating, how hungry you are, how much your muscles ache, all internal signals. So we had this idea that alexithymia was this general interoceptive impairment, a general problem working out signals from your body. And around the same time, Carl Friston and Quattrocchi put forward their model, which suggests actually it's autism, which is related to a problem perceiving signals from the body. So this is quite interesting, scientifically interesting. We had an idea that alexithymia was related to problems perceiving the state of the body. Carl and Quattrocchi had this idea that it's autism. So we could test these predictions. So our first study to test this was just a simple questionnaire study. We developed a measure of people's self-reported ability to perceive signals from their body. So working out when they're hungry, working out when their muscles ache, working out when they feel sick, working out when their heart's racing. And we measured alexithymia and autistic traits, and we found that alexithymia predicted these interoceptive problems, working out what's going on in your body, and autism didn't. We then asked about people's ability to distinguish between physical states, such as thirst, shortness of breath, and emotional states. And again, alexithymia predicted problems distinguishing between these two, not autism. We then looked for objective evidence. So we used a task where we asked people to close their eyes, to sit still, and just count the number of heartbeats they have in a minute. And you objectively record it, and you work out how good they are at perceiving their heartbeats. This is a very classic task to measure interoceptive ability. And again, we found that your ability to perceive your heartbeats was predicted by levels of alexithymia, not by a presence of autism diagnosis or autism symptom severity. Again, we looked at our gambling task. We also measured people's interoceptive ability and their alexithymia. And what we were able to show was that if you weren't autistic, you were able to use your heartbeat information, or your ability to use your heartbeat information predicted your susceptibility to this irrational behavior, as did alexithymia, and the traits didn't. So what it really seems to be is that alexithymia is associated with a general problem perceiving information from your body, working out how hungry you are, how tired you are, how fast your heart is beating. That information is useful for working out which emotional state you're in. This is all very good. We now have this idea that alexithymia is related to problems with interoception, working out the state of your body. But we went into our theory of mind problems again, because Carl Friston, James Kilner, and Sasha Underbacher argue that actually this interoception, this ability to perceive the state of your body, underlies theory of mind ability. So we argued earlier on that alexithymia was not related to theory of mind problems, but what we have is an existing theory which says interoception, which we think underlies alexithymia, is responsible for theory of mind problems. So we investigated this. We used the reading the mind in the eyes test. It's very famous. I personally don't like this test. So it's been validated as a measure of theory of mind by showing the test. But yet the task requires you to look at somebody's eye region and work out what emotion they're feeling. So we thought actually this represents a test of emotion recognition and should be predicted by alexithymia, not by autism. And so we tested this, and we're able to show actually that if you have autism, it doesn't lead to an impairment on the reading the lines in the eyes test. What matters is whether you're alexithymic or not. So all of these decades of research showing that reading the mind in the eyes is a measure of theory of mind and scores are predicted by autism, we think that's wrong. It's actually predicted by levels of alexithymia. We looked at another theory of mind task. This is Isabel and Ziabeck's movie for the assessment of social cognition. This is interesting because it has emotional items. You watch a movie and decide how Sandra is feeling. And pure theory of mind problems. You work out how Sandra is thinking. So what we predicted was that the ability to infer how someone's feeling would be predicted by alexithymia, and theory of mind would be predicted by autism, and that's exactly what we found. So interoception and alexithymia predicts how good you are at working out how somebody's feeling, whereas autism impacts your theory of mind ability, working out what someone's thinking. Very lastly, I know I'm close to running out of time, we also know the interoceptive system is related to certain sensory pathways. So working out if you've got very light touch on your skin, for instance, this is mediated by the same interoceptive system that works out how hungry or thirsty you are. And internal gastric sensations are also related to this interoceptive system. We know that there's high rates of sensory symptom problems in autism, and again we wondered whether this is really due to alexithymia or autism, because this is a really big deal. So this was a study led by Isabel York in Francesca Happey's lab, and she did a really nice study. Isabel showed that actually this is a twin study, and she showed that there was a common genetic contribution to alexithymia and sensory problems in the group of autistic individuals, and actually this was due to alexithymia, not due to autism. So the results survived even after counting for autism. So I won't take up any more of your time. This is a quick summary. I want to argue that alexithymia explains the emotional symptoms of autism and explains heterogeneity in the population of autistic individuals, certainly in relation to emotions. We also think it explains heterogeneity in eating disorders, depression and schizophrenia, and therefore may explain why you find some of the same symptoms across these conditions. We think alexithymia is it leads to difficulties working out how you feel, making decisions, and potentially be sensitive. And I think this could be really important for diagnosis and treatment, both of autism, eating disorders, and alexithymia. And lastly, what I want to say is that alexithymia is not psychopathy. I don't want to say that people with alexithymia don't have empathy. I don't think that's true at all. People with alexithymia can have a lot of compassion. What they find really hard is that if somebody's in a particular state, they find it hard to work out exactly what state they're in. They know it's negative, and they have this negative reaction. They have a compassionate reaction. They're just not sure exactly what they're. So thank you for listening. Thank you to the people that helped me with this research, particularly Caroline Katmer, Richard Cook, Rebecca Brewer, and the rest of my lab. We have a new lab member, actually. Michelle Cole had a son, Elliot, so we're very proud to welcome him to the lab as well.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Bird. We just have a little bit of time for questions. If your question does not get asked, please know that we will ask them, and we will post the responses into the comment section when the replay is available of this webinar. So firstly, how do you think alexithymia impacts higher levels of anxiety that are seen in the autism population?
It's a really good question. We know that anxiety is related to interoceptive atypicalities. So actually we think anxiety is related to too much interoception. You're too aware of your body's internal states. And I know Professor Hugo Critchley at Sussex has an idea that actually it's interoception problems which causes the anxiety in autism. I think we would probably say that actually it's alexithymia which in some cases is driving the anxiety in autism, but that's a study that we still need to investigate. But I think it's the idea that anxiety is related to atypical interoception has been around for a long time. David Clark and Corrales have argued that for decades.
Okay. So you showed the BVAQ score graph saying that alexithymia is different from autism. How about the Toronto Alexithymia Scale 20 score, self-reported alexithymia measure? Do you think that it's not a valid alexithymia measurement tool in the general population?
No, quite the reverse. So we tend to use the TAS-20, the Toronto Alexithymia Scale, more than the BVAQ. For no particular reason, then that's what we tended to start with. So we used the BVAQ in one study with my collaborator Sebastian Gay because he thinks that's a better measure. I'm fairly agnostic. Both of them seem to predict the things that we investigate.
Does this represent a different approach to understanding the phenomena that Simon Baron-Cohen describes using the binary of affective and cognitive empathy?
Yeah, I think so. So I don't like this general statement that people with autism don't have empathy. And to be honest, probably Simon wouldn't want to make a strong statement like that anymore either. So I think he uses the term empathy, and he really is talking about theory of mind, which you could call cognitive empathy. I think I would rather just not use the term empathy for that at all. That's theory of mind. Whereas when I'm talking about empathy, it very much is, I recognize that you're in a particular state, and I have the same state in myself. I have an empathic reaction, and it's very much emotional. So I think the question's right. You can separate empathy into kind of cognitive empathy and affective empathy. I think it is confusing. Let's just call it theory of mind when it's related to working out what someone's mental states are.
Have you investigated how verbal communication delay or limited verbal communication factors into this theory?
That's an excellent question. Got a wonderful postdoc, Hannah Hobson, who's really interested in language, and she's investigating this at the moment. We've got a couple of papers under review, which will go onto our website, hopefully, if they're ever accepted. So keep an eye out for those. But yes, Hannah's investigating exactly that.
Do you think that alexithymia can be improved through intervention?
Again, that's a really interesting question. There's some evidence that interoception can, this ability to perceive signals from the body. And if we're correct, and at least some part of yes, we can improve alexithymia. I haven't seen any real evidence that that's the case at the moment. That's just my hypothesis.
And last question, and as I say, if anyone's questions did not get asked, we will post them in the comment section, and we will try to field them to Geoff after the presentation. Can you talk more about the possible links between alexithymia and sensory function with possible respect to the insula? How is the ability to read one's own emotions related to reading others' emotions?
Yeah, excellent question. So I think the sensory stuff is really interesting. And again, this is a project that was led by Isabel York and is conducted in Francesca Happe's lab. So I'm tangentially related to this study. But I think that's really interesting. So the idea that it's interoceptive difficulties and alexithymia that's related to some of the sensory symptoms, at least, I think could be quite a revelation. And again, this is mostly Frankie's work, so I can say that. And in terms of the ability to represent your own emotions, I mean, that's exactly what alexithymia is. Problems recognizing your own emotions do seem to predict your ability to understand and respond to the emotions of others.
Okay, and I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. And as I say, if your question did not get asked, it will be posted in the comments section of the complete replay of this presentation, which will be available on the Spectrum news site in a couple of days. This webinar is part of an ongoing series, so please check our site for upcoming talks, which are there, and more to be announced soon. There's also video archives of previous webinars. Thank you again, Professor Bird, and thank you all for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone.